that expands the focus from individuals and how they interact to systems. And not only is it's not only the results of their research that help us do this, but this book in particular presents it in such an accessible and powerful way that we can't help but do just that with this wonderful, wonderful work. So thank you very, very much. Now I'll get to the introductions. Jennifer Hirsch is a professor of socio-medical sciences at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health. Shamus Khan is a professor of sociology and American studies at Princeton University. And together they are co-authors of Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, published by W.W. Norton. A review in Science describes Sexual Citizens as profoundly eye-opening, and the book was selected as one of NPR's best books of 2020. I agree. The research presented in Sexual Citizens was realized as part of Columbia's Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, or SHIFT, co-directed by Jennifer and clinical psychologist Claude Ann Mellons. Thank you. Turn it back to Ashley.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Again, that was Dr. Lori McDonald, our VPSA here at the university. So a few more logistical pieces for you all. You might see some chats pop up from a few of the hosts. Chris and Ali are both staff in the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention as well. They'll be providing a lot of different resources. For example, they just shared some social media information if you want to stay in touch with the authors and with the book. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm moderating the conversation today. And again, feel free at any point to go ahead and use the Q&A button to submit questions. So first of all, the book talks about the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, also known as the SHIFT survey. Can you tell us more about that study and also why you decided to write Sexual Citizens?
Sure. Of course, first, Shamus and I want to thank you for bringing us into this virtual/physical space, and many thanks to Dr. McDonald for that extremely generous introduction. This is always the moment that we wish our parents were here. So thank you so much. I'm actually going to bring you into the work through a story because, as you know, Ashley, the book is very narrative driven. And so Austin, in many ways, was one of the more engaging young people that we interviewed. He features in the only really spicy sex scene in the book, where he and his girlfriend are together off campus on a hot summer night. Not going to describe that here, just note they made their own fireworks. But he also told us a story that was distressing to hear and for him to tell. In the sexual assault, we asked them about their sexual experiences. We asked to tell us about a bad or their worst sexual experience and a good sexual experience. And so he started off by describing something which he said was weird. It happened early in his first year on campus. He arrived on campus having gone to an all-boys school and not really having had a lot of experience with girls other than his girl cousins, and as humans. And he was very anxious about his lack of sexual experience. And so there was a night when he was shuffled off to stay in someone else's room. He was in a double, and his roommate wanted to be alone with the girl his roommate was hooking up with. And so they sent Austin off to that girl's room where her roommate was in bed. And so that young woman sat up in bed and mumbled that she was kind of drunk and didn't want to do anything. And that's a weird moment, right? Because why should you have to assert a sexual boundary when someone who's virtually a stranger comes into your bedroom at night? And yet he didn't respect that. He got in bed with her and he started to touch her body. And then he stopped himself. And so that was the story he told. And then later in the interview, we said, well, can you describe what a sexual assault is? And he knew, I mean, all the students know, right? Because they get the mandatory training on what sexual assault is and that they shouldn't do it. And so he's like, yeah, it's any unwanted anything sexually. And then he paused and he became visibly distraught. His eyes welled up with tears. And he said, if you'll excuse me, fuck me. Because he couldn't believe, given who he had grown into being, that he had done that he had sexually assaulted someone. And so, if your take from that story is we have to find people who do that and get them off of our campuses. I mean, Austin did a bad thing. We don't disagree with you on that. But in Sexual Citizens, we try to change the conversation from a focus on finding and punishing people who do harm to prevention, to what Dr. McDonald flagged, to a public health approach. So when we started the work that led to Sexual Citizens, it seemed to me I'd spent my whole career working on the social organization of sexual behavior in public health. And it seemed to me that something really important was missing from the conversation, because anything that happens so frequently can't just be the product of broken people making bad choices. It has to be something that is literally designed into the system. And so in Sexual Citizens, we describe how sexual assault is built into the experience of campus life, which sounds pretty grim, right? To acknowledge how it's engineered into daily experience, except once you see how it's built in, you can have a conversation that we're having now about how we could engineer it out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I love that you all capture the nuance in the book, right? You're capturing the both and we live in a world that tends to want to be binary, right? So really appreciate the ways that you're able to hold space for that. And also for folks that don't know, we held a book club this semester for Sexual Citizens, and a piece of feedback that we consistently had is that this book does not beat around the bush, and the language that you all are willing to use and the candor with which you express that is much appreciated by students and staff and faculty alike, because we can't be shy about talking about these things. There's really too much at stake. So swear away for the rest of this chat. So the book is also centered around three big ideas: sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and sexual geographies. So these are the lens that you all explore and make sense of sexual assault. I'm curious, can you share how these ideas interact with each other?
Or like Jennifer, I'm going to use a story to illustrate it. Charisma was one of the students who described Columbia and Barnard campus, where Jennifer and I did this research with a bit broader research team. Charisma described it as a white space. And when we asked what she meant by that, she said, well, it's filled with white guys who can't dance, listen to shitty music, drink too much, and don't find me attractive. And clearly, if you listen to that story or that response, you realize that Charisma didn't really find these guys attractive either. And so one of the things that she did was connect with guys through her roommate, who was from New York. And she ended up meeting a guy who lived out in Brooklyn, and they texted back and forth for a while. And then one weekend evening, she decided to go visit him. And for those of you who don't sort of know the geography of New York, Brooklyn's not far away. It's, she was probably going 8 miles, but if the trains aren't running well, it can be kind of a nightmare of a trip. And she had one of those nightmares of a trip. It took her almost 2 hours to get out to see him. And by the time she got there, she was soaking wet. And so she got to his apartment, peeled off her clothes, and had a drink with him, smoked a little bit of a joint, and they started making out. And this was like all good, right? This was not something she wasn't expecting. She was happy with it. But then he started to put his hands on her body in a place where she didn't want them. And she moved his hands away and he put it right back. And at this point in the narrating, Charisma said to us, I never really had a plan B. My plan A was body language, and it had always worked before. Charisma then went on to describe being assaulted by him twice, although she didn't describe it as an assault. Now, you could listen to that story and you could think like, gosh, what a terrible person that guy was. We didn't interview him. We didn't have his perspective on it. I think Jennifer and I would both say not a bad read, right? Like that's not a terrible read of the story, but it kind of only gets you so far. And so, as you know, Ashley, having read the book, these three concepts, sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies, give us another way of reading it. One that doesn't sort of invalidate his responsibility, but really gets us to a place where we might be able to think less about bad people and punishing them and more about systems of change, things that we could enact that might be different. So sexual projects is the answer to the question, what is sex for? And you might think only two academics could ask a question like, what is sex for? But as it turns out, like sex is for lots of different things. It's not for reproduction for most college students. For some of them it is, but none of the college students that we talked to were trying to have children. And many of them were having sex. Sex is about pleasure, but we also know that not all sex is pleasurable. And people consent to sex all the time that isn't very pleasurable because people have sex to have different kinds of experiences, to give comfort to a partner, to come to understand who they are. We kind of need to understand what people are trying to do with their sexual and intimate lives if we want to address sexual violence. Now, this runs us into a criticism that rape is not sex, and maybe Jennifer and I are sort of tying sexual assault to sexual projects. But many of the assaults that we heard were like charismas. They occurred in contexts where things were consensual until they were not. And so trying to figure out what was happening in that situation is really important. In Charisma's case, no one had ever talked to her about what sex was for. She grew up, like many of the young people that we spoke to, in a context of silence and shame about sexuality. And that didn't really equip her to have a kind of plan for what she wanted out of her intimate life. Now, Jennifer and I are kind of agnostic about the content of sexual projects. If people don't want to have sex, that's fine. If they want to have a lot of sex, that's fine. But where we aren't agnostic, at least in terms of our ethical vision of the world, is with sexual citizenship. And sexual citizenship is really a provocation. It says people have the right to sexual self-determination, and they have the obligation to recognize equivalent rights in others. In that room, there was a profound failure of sexual citizenship, and that was a failure of the man's sexual citizenship. Because while he had a really clear sense of his own right to sexual self-determination, he had a totally impoverished sense of Charisma's fundamental equality as a person. When she moved his hand away, she was clearly conveying that she didn't want it there. And when he put it right back, he was invalidating her right to determine what it was that she wanted out of an intimate experience. Now, both sexual projects and sexual citizenship, Jennifer and I argue, are constituted by families, communities, organizations. And one of the profound failures that we see is the failure of those spaces to convey to young people that what they think of as valuable sexual projects, but also their responsibility to be good sexual citizens in the world. And here, when we refer to it as a provocation, we sort of think about like citizenship entails not just like voting, but it entails things about being a productive member of a community, and that sexuality is actually a fundamental part of it. And it's something that we as organizations and institutions, educational ones, have a responsibility for conveying. The final concept is sexual geographies. And this is the simple insight that space matters and that space is intimately intertwined with power. And if we're thinking about areas where really we could leverage our institutional environments for change, I think this concept probably has the most power. So there's a bunch of elements to the space story here. We actually see some elements in the Austin story that Jennifer told about how Austin got shuttled off to another room. But in Charisma's story, there's sort of three things that we like to highlight. First, Charisma was in this guy's space. And one of the things that we saw consistently was an interweaving of power and control over space where sex happens, that more powerful people frequently had control over where intimacy occurred, and that augmented rather than moderated existing power inequalities. Or in other words, like she was in his space and that really disempowered her, but it didn't just so happen that she was there. Often less powerful people are in spaces with more powerful people, where the powerful people control the space. The second is that some Columbia and Barnard students wouldn't have had the same challenge as Charisma because they were wealthy, and they could have just opened up an app on their phone and had a cab whisk them away. Charisma was not wealthy at all. She could not afford the $50 cab ride home, and the 2-hour train ride was an impediment. It wasn't a complete impediment, but it was certainly one that led her to make choices that she might not have otherwise made. Finally, I opened by saying she described it as a white space, not to just kind of like pull you into the story, but literally it was to Charisma a white space, a space dominated by white men who tend to drink more than other kinds of students, who had more control over the social space. And the fact that there were people on campus who controlled space that she didn't feel an affinity with, and that there was nowhere on campus where she and people she liked had control over space, drove her off campus. And our point here isn't to say like Brooklyn is a dangerous place, but instead to say that certain students have the privilege of being able to feel comfortable in spaces on campus because they have control over them, and other students do not. And so that becomes an important like lever of analysis to think about the intertwining of space and power, which catches up things like race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and so many other dimensions of difference.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate how present power is in your conversation of each of these different components, right? We don't often, for example, when it comes to sex education, talk about power at all. If we even have or talk about sex education, which I know that you all, did your study in New York. Here in Utah, it's a different culture, right? Slightly, maybe just a little bit. And we have a really unique culture that plays itself out in family, in social activities, in a lot of different aspects of life here in Utah. And Utah is also not unique in the way that we approach sex ed compared to other states across the country. So in this book, you discuss sex education as necessary for preventing sexual assaults. Can you all talk more about what you learned about the importance of sex ed through your study?
We have so much to say about sex education. Before diving into that, I do want to flag one way in which Utah is better than some other states in the United States. There are still states in which if sex ed is given, it is mandated by law that it must discriminate against people who are not heterosexual. It must tell students that homosexuality is bad. So at least that's one small win for Utah. What we found is that sex ed is sexual assault prevention. The research that Shamus and I did that we share in Sexual Citizens, as I noted, was part of this much larger study, the SHIFT project, which also included a survey and an analysis of that survey data led by my husband, John Santelli, found that women students who'd had comprehensive sex ed before coming to college, that included practicing saying no to sex that they didn't want to have, which is not abstinence-only sex education. It's just education that includes a skills development component, like any good education. Those women were half as likely to be raped in college. I just want that to settle with the apartment, right? Half as likely. That means that women who got sex education were twice as safe. And so essentially, we already have a vaccine for sexual assault. And we're choosing not to give it to children across the United States. The landscape nationally about sex education is very variable. So when we asked young people about sex education, frequently what we got was a laugh. And then they would say like, oh, you mean my sexual diseases class, that class where they showed scary pictures or made us carry around a bag of flour for a week, or tried to scare us into thinking that sex was a dirty, rotten, nasty thing, and that you should only do it with someone you love after you're married, which is a sort of weird and complicated message about sex. So sex ed is prevention. It's very unequally distributed, so that young people who live in more progressive states are more likely to get it. If they live in an urban center in a more progressive state, they're particularly likely to get it. If you go to a fancy progressive private school, you're more likely to get it. Otherwise, you're sort of out of luck. It's particularly toxic for queer students. We didn't speak with a single queer student who had felt even acknowledged to exist in the sex education that they received. So think for a minute about another behavior that young people do as they emerge into adulthood, which we think is scary and dangerous, but which we do a much better job at: driving, right? So like the thousands and thousands of lives have been saved by raising the drinking age to 21. But in general, like when your kids want to drive, you don't turn your head away and say like, oh God, not under my roof, and then like let them grab the keys when they're drunk. There's a whole system that enables young people to be what you might think of as driving citizens, right? Like they're acknowledged that driving is a legitimate desire, and they're taught how to do it safely. But that's not the only way that we avert traffic accidents. It's through road design and car design. So that's sort of public health at its best, doing what we call a multi-level intervention. And if you compare that to what exists to help young people transition into being sexually active adults, which almost everyone ends up being sexually active as an adult, they're sort of on their own, right? And we don't, Shamus and I don't deny at all that families and religious organizations play a super important role in shaping young people's sexual projects. So you could think about a sexual project as like your decision about where you want to go. But the sexual citizenship angle is how to get there without hurting other people. And that's where, by not providing sex education that that gives young people a venue to learn about these things, but that also by conveying that information shares the message that those are legitimate things to want to learn about. It's not just the content of sex education, it's that it exists. That is a really important way of acknowledging young people's sexual citizenship. And here, I mean, we imagine that many of the students at the University of Utah are from Utah. And so they are the ones to pick up the phones and call their elected officials and say, you know, if you care about sexual violence, why do we not have better legislation on comprehensive sex ed? And this is not a red state, blue state thing. Before the pandemic, Alabama, Kentucky, and Georgia all had legislation on the docket to expand access to comprehensive sex ed. And sadly, I will tell you that New York State, the sort of consummate blue state, does not have mandated sex ed. So this is about ensuring a safe passage to adulthood. It's not about forcing values on anyone or about undermining the power of families and religious institutions to shape young people's values. So I feel like it should be an obvious nonpartisan win. We feel like this is the low-hanging fruit in prevention.
Thank you for that context, especially in the midst of our kind of political world right now and this global pandemic. There's a lot of factors that are playing into our ability to, push that legislation, to get the things that college students and people far younger as well need. So one of the things that resonated most for the folks in the book club and for me personally was the way that you all talk about how we view perpetrators or people who cause harm. That's an answer that I still don't feel like I have a clear kind of way that I want to do that or that I would advise others to do that. So in the book, you talk about the story of a man who, as he's talking to you, realized that he committed assault. So along with the need for sex education that you just mentioned, this story and others in the book highlight the need for conversations for both restorative and transformative justice. So with this also taking into consideration the calls to defund and abolish the police that are gaining momentum in the mainstream attention. Can you speak more to these ideas and how we as a society should consider shaping sexual citizenship with a new set of values?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are two sort of really key inspirations for this. The first is the idea that so much of our attention has been on what to do after assaults happen. And that operates under the fantasy that if we just get punishment right, we will change behavior. And, the second insight, which is just tied to that, is reflecting on the sort of disastrous experiment over the last 40 years in the United States with mass incarceration, which also functioned under this fiction, which is that, like, if we just figure out a good way to punish people and we punish everyone, we will find ourselves on a path to justice and community reform. And, the work in that area has basically said, no, that it hasn't really worked. And it's actually come with a bunch of harms. And that the pathway to transformation is actually community investment. It's not punishment. Now, I want to be really clear here. Jennifer and I are not arguing that, like, we should never punish anyone, and that punishment is not a lever that needs to be used as part of this process. What we're suggesting instead is that it's rarely a pathway to justice and rarely a pathway to community transformation. Or another way of thinking about it is, like, we cannot punish our way out of this problem. We need to have other tools in our toolbox in order to transform it. So you referred, to the Austin story, which is the one that Jennifer opened up with. I think here also of the story of Adam. And Adam was from, not from New York, from the Midwest, and came from an incredibly conservative religious family. And a family where he couldn't really be out. And so when he got into Columbia and then finally moved to New York, he was so excited because he was like, it was almost like coming to a different kind of promised land, one where he would meet gay men and could sort of like live his truth in a different kind of way. But when he got to New York, he realized that actually it was not so great. Like that, he would meet guys on apps and things, and they would like express interest in some intimacy, but then they would just like hook up with him and ghost him, never talk to him again. And it was extremely, it was not what he wanted. There were ways that his, conservative religious upbringing had big effects on him, not just in silencing his sexuality, but also conveying to him what like a valuable relationship would be. And so he ends up being in this relationship, and he spoke really lovingly about like his boyfriend and how happy he was to have found his boyfriend and how excited he was to sort of be in this context where he could be out, where he could be with a man, and where he was in a kind of relationship context that was good for him. Except, he said, almost apologetically, my boyfriend's really forceful about sex sometimes. And then he told a story about how his boyfriend came home one evening and, in Adam's words, he basically raped me. And Adam refused to call this a rape. He didn't talk to his boyfriend about it because the relationship was so valuable to him. He didn't talk to his friends about it because he was worried that his friends would start to hate his boyfriend. He didn't talk to the university about it because he didn't want his boyfriend to get kicked out of school, which is what he imagined might happen. He obviously couldn't talk to his family about it. He didn't talk to anyone about it. And he sort of endured this because the relationship was super valuable. Now, I tell you that story, like, not to break your heart, but maybe, but like also, and to show how difficult it is to think about punishment as the way to transform what Adam experienced. And Adam's experiences are unique, but they represent a broader pattern where a lot of people don't actually want to report what happened. Not because reporting systems are terrible, not because, they really hate the way that the university deals with things, but because there are other things that are really socially valuable to them, like their relationship, like their commitment to the organizations where they met the person who assaulted them. Even sometimes, in Adam's case, like his sense of his boyfriend as a good person made it really hard for him to categorize him as a perpetrator. Instead, what we suggest is sort of like thinking about, well, what could help Adam? And there are a bunch of things that could help Adam that aren't just about figuring out a good way to punish his boyfriend. I mean, one is that there's really no feedback loop, that people who commit harm frequently often don't know. And to return to Jennifer's driving metaphor, like, you know, if you harm someone, and then there are steps that you have to take to sort of get through that harm. And it doesn't mean you can never drive again. It doesn't mean that you have to move to a different state. It doesn't mean that you need to quit your job and join a new job. It means something else. It means that we as a community decide, like, actually, you know, you can take a defensive driving class. You might have a suspended license for a period of time that limits the ways that you can act. But here, Jennifer and I think, like, you can't make sense of Adam's experience without making sense of his enormous sort of domination by a sense of heterosexuality and the illegitimacy of his sexual project and sexual desires. And so grounding transformational projects, not just in, like, how is it that we change our adjudication system, but how is it that we can create greater conditions of equity for somebody like Adam so that he has resources to go to, but also so that like, he doesn't have just such an impoverished sense of the own legitimacy of his own desires and such a kind of desperation to hold on to something that's causing harm to him. That means thinking much more broadly, where, as Jennifer sort of very powerfully said, like, sex ed is an enormous part of this, but it's not enough. The other things that we need to do is try and build communities of equity, because that disempowerment that Adam felt really put him in a fragile, precarious, and risky position.
And you talk about how a lot of different concepts are not enough. For example, just getting consent is not enough, right? There's a lot of things that play into that, and about power specifically. Before I ask the next question, Jennifer, did you want to jump in at any point?
Well, when you say, you know, just getting consent is not enough, we always want to underline that, like, it's not that teaching students about consent is bad, but it's like teaching people to drive by only teaching them to stop at stop signs. Like, if that is what you know about driving, Shamus and I do not want to share the road with you, right? Driving, sex is complicated. Like, driving involves, like, a lot of being able to read cues from the people around you. And so, sure, teach about consent, but also think more generally about the rules of the road.
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm really struck by how power is involved in every aspect of this, not just the power of individual actors within their social identities, but also the power of, like, cultural and societal actors and things like that. So as you talk about the role of power in sexual assault, can you speak to what you were able to reveal in your work about the way that race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other social identities can influence the likelihood of sexual assault?
Yeah, we really want to push beyond a framework of gender-based violence to think about power-based violence. I mean, obviously, all of the early feminist work on sexual assault has been fundamental for forcing society to recognize this as a problem. And yet, you can't understand campus sexual assault, you can't understand sexual violence in the world, as your land acknowledgement reminded us, without thinking about how violence is a manifestation of many different forms of social domination. For example, in the interviews that we did with students at Columbia and Barnard, when we spoke with Black women, every single one recounted experiencing some form of unwanted sexual touching on campus. Every single one. And frequently, that wasn't even in response to our question about sexual violence. It was just in their descriptions of what it is like to be a Black woman on those campuses. And our contention is not that those campuses are necessarily more racist or more hostile climate for students of color than any other primarily white institution. It's just that sexual violence is a part of white supremacy. It is a way that those messages about the devaluation of the bodies of people of color are communicated and experienced in people's bodies. And we see that also when we spoke with Black men, there's a lot of fear of false accusation, pretty much among all the men that we spoke with, which is just fact, vanishingly rare. And yet the ways that Black men spoke about that fear was inextricable from their general feelings of precarity on campus in a way that drove home yet again how you can't separate race from gender in thinking about sexual violence. For example, Carl, all of the names that we use obviously are pseudonyms. So Carl told us a story. He never engaged in drunk sex because he said that for him, it felt too dangerous to be drunk and to have sex. He wanted to have command of all of his faculties. But he met a girl at a party, a white girl who was interested in him. She was drunk and he was interested in her too, but he was like, whoa, this is not a safe situation for me. And so they left the party and they walked around. And then they walked around and then they kept walking around. And finally, it was like the wee hours of the morning when he felt like she was sober enough and they went back to his room. And then he like doubted that assessment. And he was like, you know what, let's talk some more. And so it was early in the morning when finally they had sex. And then, and this, we admit, this sounds a little bit weird, but as she was leaving, he recorded her saying that she'd had a good time without asking her. And so he recorded her secretly. And as he told us later, he had done his homework and he knew that New York was what's called, sort of ironically, given the conversation that we're having is about sexual assault, but New York is a one-party consent state where you can tape record somebody and it's admissible as evidence in court, even if you haven't told them. And so he did that to protect himself because his take, which was also the take of the young man of color who was on our undergraduate advisory board, he's like, it's fine in the moment, but the next day, if someone changes their mind, who do you think is going to be believed? So race was an inextricable part of understanding students' both actual vulnerability and feelings of vulnerability, both to being sexually assaulted or to being accused. And the same is true of any other dimension of social inequality. So Shamus has already sort of begun the conversation about queerness, but when we talk about this, we always think about the story of Maddie, who was assigned male at birth and transitioning to living publicly as a woman. And she was very reliant during that time on her girlfriend. Her girlfriend provided a lot of emotional support. The physical intimacy was important to both of them. But Maddie experienced that intimacy in a hard way because her girlfriend really wanted her to use her penis in sex. Her girlfriend really wanted to have penetrative penis in the vagina intercourse. And Maddie really didn't want to because that felt like an erasure of the woman that she was becoming. And as Maddie described, her girlfriend's wants overtook her needs. It was a war of attrition. And so I guess in terms of the conversation about power, what that lifts up is that you don't necessarily have to have power to use power. Maddie's girlfriend was not a socially powerful person. But also, the power there is really the power of social exclusion that all queer students face on campus. And Columbia is a relatively friendly campus for students who are not cis hetero. It was the first campus in the United States to have sort of a gay rights society very early in the 60s. So, go Lions, but still, students don't navigate through the same terrain of privilege as cis hetero students do. And so Maddie was vulnerable to being raped by her girlfriend because she needed her girlfriend's support as she was transitioning. So the bigger takeaway is that it can't just be gender-based power. We have to be attentive to inequalities, both social inequalities, gender, race, disability, but also situational ones. The difference between a first-year student and a fourth-year student is sort of like the difference between a frontline worker and a CEO, right? In terms of mastery of space, in terms of social connections. And so that is not an equal interaction. I think frequently, it's not that the fourth-year student is a bad person, but if you think about the red zone, some of that is women who are first-year students encountering men who are older in spaces controlled by those men, where there is alcohol provided by those men. It doesn't make those men necessarily bad people, but it's like being on the road and some people are driving Hummers and some people are on bicycles, right? You just like, if you get sideswiped, you're in big trouble.
Yeah, thank you for that. So Maddie's story, along with all the other stories you've talked about today, as well as the other stories in the book, really provide a lot of rich lessons for us. And I can only imagine how much vulnerability that took for the students to share. And I just wanted to ask a question about the research that you do, because it is a newer way to approach it that is not necessarily mainstream. So what surprised you in doing the research that you all did for this book? And did you experience any challenges or difficulties while conducting the research with students?
So I think one of the things that surprised us was the number of times that people described sexual assault as having sex. And actually, this has happened in many of the stories that we've already told. So in Charisma's story, she told us about how she clearly said no, but she described it as having sex. Adam, and with his boyfriend, described it as having sex. Like, and in one of the stories, there was a young man named, we named him Eddie in the book, who he told us this story. He said, I put on a tie, so I knew I was going to have sex. And in that story, he described being asked out to a formal by a woman who he knew liked him. He didn't really like her that much, but she was from like, he was in a fraternity. She was in a sorority that was like a high value sorority. They went out together. He was an in-season athlete. She got very drunk. It was pouring rain when they were finally coming back from that. And he couldn't figure out a way to like get her to her dorm and then get himself home because he didn't feel it was right to just drop her off at the door. She was so drunk. And so he decided to bring her back to his place. And then he described to us, you know, as presenting himself as the aggrieved party, like the person who had been harmed in this situation, having sex with her as she went in and out of consciousness, which is clearly an assault. And you know, not all stories are sort of that extreme in this particular case. Like this particular case is sort of a dramatic rendering of one, but there were lots of instances where people, for all kinds of reasons, didn't talk about what it was as that they experienced or that they did as a kind of assault. I think that really surprised us. In terms of the research design, how we got the engagement from the student body that we did and how we ended up sort of getting all this information, just I'll mention quickly one thing about the design and then a little about, I think, why the design of the project allowed us to get so much rich information from students. The portion of the work that Jennifer and I co-led was the qualitative portion of the work, which involved 3 studies. One, we interviewed 151 students. We spent 2 hours with them on average, which meant like talking to them about their lives before college, their sex lives in college, their sexual experiences, their experiences with assault. For a subsection of those students, about 25 of them, they had so many stories to tell that we did up to 2 rounds of follow-up interviews, spending 6 hours with them. So that's a bunch of the narrative. But in addition to that, we wanted to see students sort of talk with one another. So we ran focus groups, 17 focus groups, some that just were like collections of students. Others were LGBTQIA students, students of color, first-year college students, religiously engaged students, women identifying students, different kinds of students to see how they talked about sex. But the interviews and the focus groups gave us sort of how people speak about things, but they don't give us necessarily practice. And so in addition to that, we did hundreds and hundreds of hours of community observation. Now, Jennifer and I were able to do some of this in like the cafeteria and at sporting events, but obviously like you couldn't, it would be weird to see me or Jennifer standing by a keg at a party or playing, video games at night on a couch with students. And so we hired younger people who then did observation in fraternities and sororities, but also just hanging out with students as they made dinner on a Saturday night and then played Catan, and were on intramural sports teams, were part of religious student life organizations, always public about what we did. Now, you may wonder, like, why did anybody talk to you? And I think the reason people spoke to us was twofold. First, there's a real sense, I think, on Columbia's campus, but I think at lots of campuses, that like the students want to be good people. They want to get this right. And I think they understood that our project was a really serious scientific attempt to move the needle on our understanding of what was happening. The second, probably more powerful explanation was that we designed the project as a community-based participatory research project. Let me say that again, since I stumbled over it. A community-based participatory research project. And what a project like that is one that builds in the people that you're trying to influence into the design from the very beginning. So we had two major groups. One was an institutional advisory board, which was sort of dean of students, counseling and psychological services, facilities. Anyone who we thought might have some impact on this met with us with regularity to talk about how we were designing the project, what we were finding, what we were concluding, and then what could be done about it. But there was also a student advisory board where we met with 20 students every Monday morning from 8 till 10 in the morning to talk about everything from before we ever designed the survey or a single research instrument. We talked to the students about how they talked about things and what would be useful. And the aim wasn't to get like methodological advice from them, but it was to get their point of view and to build them into the design from the very beginning. And that helped our research, but I think it also gave Jennifer and I some insights for communities that are seeking to transform what's happening, which is to sort of, not just have like a blue ribbon committee of important people, but to try and get all kinds of folks in with a variety of perspectives to share those perspectives and then use them to try and realize change.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, Jennifer, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I just wanted to piggyback onto what Shamus was saying about realizing change. That one of the things that people have asked us for as we've been in conversation with so many campuses is a thing to use the book on their campus, just like book club 2.0. And so using the idea of sexual geographies, we've designed a roadmap for institutional change, which is called the Space Toolkit, the Sexual Assault Prevention and Campus Equity Toolkit. And it brings together the idea of sexual geographies with questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making the point that like we're not going to get to campuses that have less sexual violence if we stay in the mode of just telling people not to assault better. And that a powerful and under-leveraged strategy is to actually think about what we can do to equalize the spaces that students have access to, whether that's changing up housing lotteries or thinking about providing more social space for different groups of minoritized students. We're really excited to partner with campuses who are thinking about what it looks like to do prevention at the community level.
We are very excited to start using that toolkit and on our campus. So I'm sure we could talk about research and that aspect forever for the entirety of this, but I'd love right now for us to transition to Q&A from the folks that are attending today. So we do have a few questions already. I'd love for folks that have any follow-up questions to go ahead and put them in now or be thinking about them. We have about 35 minutes left. So we'll just go ahead and start with the first question we had submitted. Does the data about women being less likely to be assaulted with the presence of previous comprehensive sex education also relate to boys? Was there any data on sex education as prevention pertaining to rates of perpetration?
So it's not impossible to measure perpetration, but it's hard because students have gotten the memo that perpetration is bad. And so response rates are not great. And so in the survey, and like we actually had an overall response rate to the survey. I don't know if Shamus noted this, of 67%, which is astonishing, astonishingly high for campus-based survey research. And we found about the same rates of having experienced sexual assault as other campuses find. And we found very low rates of admitting to perpetration. So it's hard to know what to do with those data. I dropped in the chat another paper I wrote. I put it in the chat because it's behind a paywall. So there's the actual file that maps out why it does make sense to think about comprehensive sex education as a strategy for primary prevention, because the things that we know that comprehensive sex ed can affect are the things that we also know are precursors of being someone who assaults someone. So it makes like you can do the mental map. In fact, that paper does the mental map for you of why that makes sense. We think that is sort of the next frontier in research, is doing work longitudinally that follows young people who've had comprehensive, medically accurate, age appropriate, culturally sensitive, inclusive sex education, to follow those young people over time, and to assess the impact on the likelihood of assaulting someone else. So I would say stay tuned. Maybe in 5 years we'll have that data. But in the meantime, it's very likely, we would say yes, it's very likely that it does also reduce perpetration.
And along with that, something that I feel like a lot of we sure do in the MCVP, and I'm sure sexual violence prevention educators across the country grapple with, is folks saying, why are you teaching about consent? Why are you teaching about sex ed? Shouldn't this come way before students even set foot on a college campus? And we definitely agree. And at the same time, we can also accept that students are already in college, and change in that way takes time, right? So someone asked if you have any recommendations, books, courses, etc., on helpful resources for helping teenagers cultivate sexual citizenry.
So, I mean, it depends here. I think, one of the challenges with talking about teenagers is it's a wide age range. And so immodestly, I will sort of recommend actually using the book. And one of the things that Jennifer and I have done, I just threw into the chat our resources page. There's a discussion guide that we created. And it's sort of to use the book as part of, a conversation. And actually, you don't even have to, the part of the plan of the guide is that, like, you don't have to read the whole book. We point you to pages where different kinds of stories are told, and you'll see actually some of those stories, charismas are here, are outlined in the guide, because I think it can be really hard. It's hard to speak really vaguely with young people about things like in the abstract. At the same time, they're not really going to want to talk about their own experiences or desires. And so using the book, which are like very closely told stories of something that people experienced, and then talk about like, okay, why did that happen? How could it have happened differently, et cetera. I think also recognizing the importance of comprehensive age-appropriate sexuality education, and if it's not being provided, identifying a curriculum. Jennifer and I don't endorse any one curriculum over another, but we do think that the Our Whole Lives curriculum, of which there's one that is a religious-based curriculum out of the Unitarian Church, and then a secular version of the same one, can be very effective. And the nice thing about that one in introducing it to kids is that, like, it's not just introducing to them as kids. It talks about sexuality not as something that you develop as a, like, in puberty and then just have, but instead as like a life project. It's part of a broader life project that many of us sort of experience. And so I think that can be a really helpful thing. Then finally, and Jennifer may have other like reading recommendations, the thing about sex is that it's everywhere. It's in all novels and movies. It's in all kinds of stories, and actually religious texts have all kinds of narratives about people's sexual experiences. And Jennifer and I have this moment in the book where we say, it's not a talk, it's a conversation. And so instead of just thinking about like, what is the resource I can use to check off this box? And I'm not suggesting that's what the questioner was asking anyway, but like, it would be like, how is it that you can make this conversation just a part of conversations, where when you watch a movie together and you see a really healthy or beautiful relationship, you point it out and note positive examples of sexuality and commitment that meet your values as a family. And that when you see things that are, not what you think of as an appropriate way to be with other people in terms of respecting who they are, you actually can have that conversation too. Opening up the space for young people to be able to have a conversation with you is so important. And I know I said it was the last thing, but I'm going to say one more thing. There was a notable difference between young people who were able to talk with their parents about an experience of assault and those who were not. And there were two notable things about it. The first is that even if parents do an incredible job with their kids in terms of sex ed, everything, those kids are going to encounter other kids. That's just kind of how sex works, right? There are going to be other people involved, and harm is possible, even if you do the best possible job. But if harm happens, you want for your kid to be able to talk to you about it and not feel like they can't talk to you because you're just so mad that they had sexual contact in the first place, or you just think like it was wrong, or they've just have experienced every moment where sexuality emerges as shutting it down, not under my roof, we can't have this conversation. The second thing I'll say is that of every single story that we heard about kids and conversations with sex, they were all with moms. We had one story of a conversation with a dad, and it was a negative story. So it was like, I shouldn't say that. I should be accurate to our data. But like, men really need to step up as part of this conversation and sort of like give up on the trope of boostering for boys and sexual protection for girls, and actually do their job as human beings and sort of move beyond that and open up these as points of conversation. And so I think, in summary, use our book, but there are lots of resources out there, some educational, but also everyday moments where this can become part of what it is to raise a young person and not have talks with them, but have conversations where you also listen.
And so just to build on what Shamus said, because I feel like this is, it's a question that we get so frequently, that parents want to do better and feel like they don't know what the path forward looks like. So just a couple of thoughts. Shamus said a minute ago that, when your child has sex, it will be with other people, right? I mean, they'll have sex alone, but then eventually they'll have sex with other people. And so I think we need to move beyond thinking about cultivating young people's sexual citizenship as about keeping our kids safe, and thinking about cultivating sexual citizenship as a way of keeping everyone safe, right? In the same way that like you wear a mask maybe to keep yourself safe, but it's an act of community, right? It's how we care for each other. And so if you're committed to sexual citizenship, it is not enough to support it for your kid. It has to be something where you engage at the community level. So when the kids notice what their parents do. And so if your kid sees you stepping up to advocate for comprehensive sex ed in their school, or even just calling the principal to learn more about what's on offer, that's a really powerful act. And so to see you engaging at the community level, as opposed to only focusing on this at home. That's a sort of very like prototypical American approach, is to only think about like, I'm gonna get my family, we're gonna take care of our own. Another point in terms of like what kids see is that if you want to cultivate your child's sexual citizenship, if you believe that you want them to experience sexual intimacy with someone they care about, who cares about them, when in a committed relationship, there's really nothing that you can do that's more powerful than actually letting them do that in your home. And so I realize that parents have a range of values positions about when it's appropriate for people to be sexually active. But I can't even get my kids to floss, right? Like you can't control the choices that your children make. with their bodies. All you can do is provide a context that steers them towards making ones that you think are better. And there's research on this. Amy Shalet's book which compares how American parents and Dutch parents manage the sleepover. So the sleepover, when your child is in a committed relationship, let them invite their partner for dinner and make sure they know that they can stay for breakfast. And it is the most awkward cup of coffee you will ever make. I can tell you from experience, but it also conveys a really powerful message, which is that you see your child emerging into adulthood and that you acknowledge that sex and caring and commitment are part of the vision that you have for them in their future. So that's one really powerful thing that that's not about having young people cultivate their own sexual citizenship, but it's about building a sexual citizenship affirming environment. Then I have two more specific recommendations. One is a book that I love by award-winning sex educator Shafia Zaloom. I'll drop the name in the chat. It's called Sex, Teens, and Everything in Between. And Shafia is terrific. And this is like, don't give your kids Our Bodies, Ourselves, right? Don't give them The Joy of Sex. It's not that those are bad books, but like this is a book that is written for teenagers. So that's a great book. And then the other series of books that we love, and these I've, disclaimer, written by a friend of mine, are actually children's books. It's a series of books called First Conversations. One is about race, one is about gender, and one is about consent. And, like when you have a holiday event and some relative wants to hug and kiss your child, you have a really powerful moment of teaching sexual citizenship there by saying to your kid, you don't have to kiss Uncle Harry if you don't want to. Uncle Harry, like, is it okay with you if Uncle Harry gives you a hug? So there are things that you can do in parenting to convey sexual citizenship in ways that are not about sexual interactions. And if you worry about beginning those conversations, these books for young children are really, if you have a child who's 3 or 4 or 5, are a really great way to start those conversations at the age at which they really should be started.
Thank you for that advice. And we have a wealth of resources coming into the chat right now. So be sure that you all are saving those if you're interested. So someone said, I work with people who are accused of sexual misconduct. The experience of Austin is something that I hear often. Do you have a strategy for being compassionate with those who cause harm while also helping them acknowledge that harm?
I'd be a little hesitant to give any sort of clinical or practical suggestions here because, what Jennifer and I did over the course of these interviews, especially with our interviewees, was to try and extract stories. I mean, extract maybe sounds a little bit too brutal in what it was that we did, but sort of very sensitive to the fact that I am not a clinical psychologist. And so I don't want to give recommendations that either are clinically inappropriate or just, they're not grounded in what it is that I know. And so Jennifer and I try to kind of stay in our lane of social analysis, not individual analysis. So I will punt a little bit on that question, but I will also say that, like, we could think on a community level about what it means to make space for people who have caused harm. And, the legal system that we really work within is an adversarial system. It's an adversarial system by design. So we shouldn't think like adversarial bad, but the sort of, and allow me to be a dorky academic for a moment, the adversarial system, the logic of it within law is that two people make very, very strong articulations of their interests, and then a disinterested third party evaluates those two things and adjudicates the case. But the challenge is that when you're talking about something like sexual assault, like the idea that there would be anyone who would say, yes, I did this. I'm sorry I harmed that other person. Under systems, under an adversarial system, is just like, it's kind of naive, right? I mean, many people go into deep protectionist mode as soon as they're confronted with something like this. And it's not just the adversarial system, it's also even this language of, say, perpetrator. Jennifer and I are really informed in this sort of restorative justice framework by the race literature. And in particular, there's a book by Khalil Muhammad called The Condemnation of Blackness. And in that book, what Professor Muhammad does is sort of outline how Black Americans, and in particular Black men, were transformed from being people who committed criminal acts to criminals. So the difference between someone who commits a criminal act is that they're a human being who did something wrong. Criminals is a personality type. It actually defines who they are in their being. And so in this book, The Condemnation of Blackness, which is sort of how social statistics in the progressive era helped make this change, where Irish Americans, and my mother is from Ireland, so I'll own that category, were as likely to commit crimes as Black Americans, but they were read as people who committed crimes, whereas Black people were seen as criminal. It's in the fiber of their being. And there's something about our sexual assault discourse, in particular discourse about predators, that sort of suggests that, like, it is who you are as a person. You are a predator, rather than you are someone who committed harm. And here, I think it's important to note that the kind of perspective that Jennifer and I present in this book, and more generally, does not address all kinds of sexual assault. So we argue that sexual assault is not one thing, it's many different kinds of things. And what that partially means is that assault that happens in the context of a long-term committed relationship is different than assault that happens where you meet someone on a dance floor, and is different than assault that happens by a stranger on a subway, right? And we're not saying any is worse than the other, but they're just different things. At the same time, like, a lot of assaults are not committed by serial predators, by people who are seeking to commit harm. And so part of what, when I make that argument, and when we make that argument about predators and the language that we use, we're not talking to all cases. There are predators out there, but we're just suggesting that, like, not all the people who commit assaults are predators. Some of them are people who committed a harm that's important for them to recognize as a harm, but that may not define them as a person. And so I hope that for the person who asked the question, that gives them some way to think about it. I just don't want to, I don't want to say, this is how you talk to people like this, because it's not actually something we did. When we got the story from Eddie, where he described having sex with someone as they went in and out of consciousness, we didn't say to him, you raped her, you need to change your behavior. That can be another discussion point. There's a reason why we didn't do that. And so we never actually talked to people in the way that this person who's doing that advocacy does. And so I don't want to offer recommendations that are inappropriate.
Yeah, that's very fair. Appreciate that. So our next question is about sexual citizenship. So this person asked, I'm curious about the terms sexual citizen and sexual citizenship. As I was reading the book, I couldn't help but think that sexual autonomy, sexual self-determination, or sexual agency would be a sufficient term. I'd like to know what added features or characteristics does sexual citizenship have that sexual autonomy, self-determination, or agency don't quite capture?
So, we are fans of sexual autonomy, sexual self-determination, and sexual agency. So those are all under the umbrella of sexual citizenship. But there was a story, a sort of a refrain that we heard so persistently, in particular from the women that we spoke with in describing experiences that they'd had, where they would talk about being with somebody in their room at the end of the night and wanting to get out of there. And they would say, well, I just gave him a blowjob to get out of there. And it was so distressing and those are not assaults. We're not claiming that those are assaults, but it was very distressing to hear from women who in pretty much every other aspect of their life were fully self-determining, ambitious, clear about what they wanted, making it happen, that in terms of sex, they felt like they didn't have the right, like A, to just leave, but B, that they owed someone else pleasure, and C, that the receiver of that pleasure was fine with them doing it without really checking if they wanted to do it. And so what we saw in those interactions were two failures of sexual citizenship, which I think explains what's missing from just thinking about sexual autonomy or self-determination, which is that we have failed to cultivate a feeling of sexual citizenship in so many young people, a feeling that they have a right to choose their sexual experiences, but we've also failed to cultivate awareness that other people have the right to choose their sexual experiences. And so all those blowjob recipients were also deficient in their sexual citizenship by not checking in with those young women. And so what sexual citizenship invokes that's missing in those other ideas is what people owe each other. It's not just about getting what you want, it's about our shared obligation to make sure that what you want doesn't trespass on what someone else wants, and that someone else feels like they have the safety and the space to articulate what they want. So citizenship is about, as a broader idea, being in community with other people. And we understand this is like, we can have totally nerd out about the conceptual literature on the idea of sexual citizenship and the way in which it can be exclusionary, because citizenship is fundamentally in some ways deployed in an exclusionary way, right? Like either you're a citizen of the US or you're not. And so that's not the way in which we mean the word. Rather, the citizenship in terms of our shared obligation to live in a community in which everyone can thrive.
That language aspect is really important, and I do feel like you all emphasize that throughout your book. So thank you for that. We did have one comment in case you wanted to kind of respond to it. Someone said, I've been trying to talk about education and reform for sexual assault and sexual health for years. And while punishment and cancel culture has been the go-to, it does not solve the root of the issue. I'm often met with backlash and hate. I appreciate this conversation so much.
It's nice to hear it, and I think what we are trying to do within this work is to open up a different kind of conversation where a lot of the discussion about sex and sexuality among younger people is a discussion grounded in silence and fear and shame. That as Jennifer said when she was talking about sex ed, that a lot of sex ed is about the diseases that you will get if you have sex and unwanted pregnancy, which the second part of that is actually kind of homophobic because a lot of people have sex that isn't about pregnancy, but it's also about all the terrible things that will happen to you if you have sex. And what we are trying to do in this work is open up a different kind of emotional tenor to the conversation, which is grounded much more in empathy and hope. And it's hard to do that sometimes. You hear a story like Eddie's and you're like, that's the I put on a tie so I knew I was going to have sex story. And it's hard to have empathy for Eddie, and it's hard to be hopeful, but this is actually part of what, and this returns to the methods discussions, people like Jennifer and me do. And that is that the aim of an ethnographer is not to judge people. Instead, it's to understand their point of view in order that you might generate a better collective understanding of what's happening. It doesn't mean you have to agree with their point of view. It doesn't mean that you have to excuse their point of view, but we can't just stand in a position of judgment. We have to try and stand from a position of empathetic understanding and then try and transform that into a hopeful vision. And that's what we're really trying to do with this book.
Great, thank you. We have one more question in the queue, but I just wanted to open it up in case anyone else has some burning questions. Feel free to submit it again in the Q&A if you have them. For now, I think you've kind of hit on this a lot in different ways, but what would you describe as comprehensive sex education?
So I actually dropped in the chat the National Sex Education Standards, which provide the essential minimum core content for each year, beginning in kindergarten, going through 12th grade, for what should be included in gold standard sex education. And obviously, I just want to make this point in case it's not obvious. Sex education in kindergarten is not about genitals. It's about respecting other people's body space. And it has been shown that starting early with sex education is highly protective against childhood sexual abuse. Because when you teach young people that their bodies are their own and that nobody has the right to do something to their body that they don't want, and that they should tell a grown-up if something happens, then it gives them a language for interpreting what they experience. Shamus and I were so struck by the story of one young woman who was assaulted on her first night of campus. And the day after that, went to the consent session. And that was when she realized, that was when she understood what had happened to her. So here she is, an 18 or 19-year-old woman at a elite educational institution who had never learned that nobody had the right to touch her if she didn't want to. So anyway, those are the national, so that was a little bit of a digression there, but there are national standards. Shamus and I are not sex educators, and so there's a reason that we don't say like do this or do that, but there's national standards are the ones that schools should be using. They're the ones that we used, my husband and I, when we developed the sex ed curriculum for our son's elementary school. And I just want to flag, if you're interested in doing this at your kid's school, that it's not just something that happens in science class. There's been untapped opportunities for wraparound, integrated, comprehensive sex ed that uses the books that young people read in literature classes, and that uses history classes to raise questions about power and gender and discrimination against queer people. Think about like when you teach about the Japanese internment, that is relevant to sexual violence prevention, right? Because it's about who has the power to literally put other people's bodies to incarcerate them. So it's I think helping young people make these connections in a way that feels both like a way to understand the world around them and also a way to understand the futures that they want to build for themselves is so much more powerful than just showing them pictures of fallopian tubes.
Wow, thank you both so much. We're going to start wrapping up now. Really, really appreciate all the wisdom that you've poured out to us in the past hour and a half or so. So folks of you that have read the book, I really would encourage you to think of just one person that you think in your life you could share this book with, and that might really benefit from the things that they're learning, whether it's a fellow parent or another student. This book is available to check out from both our county library system and the Salt Lake City Public Library. And also you can just Google Sexual Citizens, and I'm sure they'll come up with multiple links for you to purchase the book as well. Wanted to share also again the authors and their hashtag and their social media. Please give them a follow. They are brilliant individuals, and I'm sure that they would love to engage with you in all of their free spare time regarding preventing sexual violence. So just to wrap up, thank you again so much, Dr. Hirsch and Dr. Khan, for engaging our campus community in this really, really important work. And thank you to each and every one of you attendees who has made this conscious decision to be here and to learn and to engage. We are immensely, immensely grateful for it. And as you would probably guess, the work does not stop here in an hour-and-a-half long public lecture. We would love for you to engage with us in the way that looks best for you, recognizing again that we are, all over involved in our own ways. But this work takes everyone on our campus if we truly want to shift culture. So please check out our social media handles that Chris has posted in the chat, our website as well. We're in a really unique position on this campus to be doing this work. And we'd love for you to learn more about us and our story through those various ways to engage. So is there anything else that I've forgotten to mention, any of the other hosts? Great. So this session was recorded. We will be posting it to our YouTube channel and we'll send it out to you all that have registered. Again, thank you for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being in conversation with us, Ashley.
Thanks.